Something that I have always advocated for in the work that I do across the social change space, and in particular working with young grassroots change makers, is this idea of the importance of having an abundance mindset. And we live in a society where things like extractive capitalism are very much grounded in these underlying mental models and assumptions and attitudes and beliefs that are grounded in this idea of scarcity and this idea that we have to compete with one another in order to survive, rather than to come together and collaborate and recognize that when we work with one another, we have more than enough. I've never really been able to articulate it until probably the last 12 or so months, when I really came to understand what abundance truly means as a law of the earth. And I speak about abundance as being a natural law of the earth because I think it accurately represents a really kind of core aspect of this idea of potential and change in ecological systems, and we as humans are part of a grand ecological system. Ecology is all about complexity, cooperation, diversity, and the way that big systems function. And so I had this profound realization when I was growing my first sunflower, of all things. I planted about 5 sunflower seeds in my front garden, and one of those 5 seeds began to grow and bloom into this gorgeous sunflower. And so I watched this flower bloom and grow into this beautiful sunflower, and then it eventually started to produce seeds. As I was saving some of the seeds, I saved maybe 40 seeds that were probably viable from this one sunflower. And I realized that one sunflower seed that I began with held within it the potential for at least 40 more sunflowers. And then each of those 40 sunflowers would hold the potential to produce 40 more seeds. And so it was just like this huge network, this huge kind of spiraling, this exponential growth of the potential to grow sunflowers. And if I was to plant all of the seeds from just that first sunflower that I'd grown, and then I planted all of those sunflower seeds, that's the potential for at least 64,000 sunflowers, which was a crazy thing to think about. And then you take a step back and you think, okay, not all of these seeds are able to reach their full potential. Not every single one of those seeds is going to grow and bloom into a full sunflower. I have a 635 square meter property that I live on. It's a relatively small suburban yard. Obviously, there is no room for 64,000 sunflowers. I started thinking about how there are all of these natural limits in place that kind of stop all of this potential from necessarily manifesting. There are natural limits, not only in terms of the space I have, but how much soil I can have access to, how much nutrients is in that soil, how much sunlight is able to reach each part of my garden. All of these different kind of like limiting factors that will affect how many of those sunflowers can actually grow and thrive at any given moment. And I had this realization that while the possibilities for growth are abundant, the earth has a way of naturally regulating how many of these sunflowers can manifest at once. And it ensures that it only allows enough, what is enough for the system to grow at once and to flourish. And as well as these kind of like natural limits that are enforced by the earth or the environment around me, there are also those human limitations. I can only plant so many seeds in one day. I could never physically plant 64,000 seeds with my hands. There's only so much money that I have to buy fertilizer or compost, and I may only have a desire for a handful of sunflowers because I want to have a diverse garden. And I want to make sure that I've got the space for all of these other plants to play their role in this little ecosystem that I've produced. And so the abundant potential for all of these sunflowers to exist in my garden, they only exist as potential, not necessarily realized potential. And this got me thinking about this idea of abundance more in terms of potential than physical abundance. Nature is consistently demonstrating this kind of principle or this law of abundance through cycles of growth, reproduction, regeneration. But what this really got me thinking about was that natural abundance and true abundance is not about excess. It's not about having the most that we could possibly have. This got me thinking about how the potential for abundance is ever present in most ecosystems that you could turn to, but the actual manifestation of that potential is always governed by these natural constraints. It reminded me of when I went to the Southern Great Barrier Reef, the Bundaberg area, 2 years ago now. And I went to go and watch the turtle hatchlings. It's something that you can go and do. And if you are in Queensland or you're ever visiting Queensland in the summertime or early autumn, I recommend you do it. If you go in the first half, you get to go and watch the big turtles laying the eggs. And if you go in the second half, you get to watch the little turtle hatchlings coming out and making their way to the ocean. And it's really special. You can't really take like photos or anything like that. There's not allowed to have any artificial light introduced to the area. They actually have limits in the areas surrounding like the national park to prevent light pollution coming in. But once you go and you can experience it, and I have this visceral memory of standing there and I got to hold one of the torches and you hold these torches and basically guide them to the ocean. And this tickling my feet, just this constant little tickling on my feet of all of these baby turtles crawling over my feet. But turtles, like a lot of aquatic marine species, they lay enormous amounts of eggs, and the survival rate of a lot of these animals is quite low due to just the natural environmental factors and things like predation. Now, obviously, with things like climate change and human-induced pollution and all of these other challenges, these already relatively small survival rates are getting even smaller, which is obviously a challenge for biodiversity. But it's this idea that even in like the optimal conditions, the earth is always going to place limiting factors on the potential. And so even though there is this like abundance of baby turtles in the ecosystem, not all of them are going to survive. Only a few of them are actually going to realize their full potential as a turtle. And it's the same thing with any kind of seeds in a garden, in an ecosystem. A single plant can produce hundreds of seeds, if not thousands of seeds in a season, and only a very small fraction of these are actually going to grow into full plants. We could turn to something like a forest where, the forest floor is always covered in these little seedlings, but only a small few of them are actually going to grow to their full potential because of limitations like light being blocked out by the surrounding trees. This kind of then got me thinking about how there are these possibilities all around us. The potential is abundant, but the earth is going to naturally limit how much of it can manifest at once. And this limitation is, I think, something that we could define as what is enough. So I've started thinking of this idea of abundance as enoughness rather than excess. And I think that we have a tendency to think of abundance as excess just because of the kind of underlying cultural conditioning that we have living in a capitalist society where, the key logic that organizes a capitalist society is this idea of competition and scarcity. And so when we conceptualize abundance within those frames of reference, we think of it more as excess than enough. And so in a society that kind of promotes this mentality of more is better, I think that if we want to move away from overconsumption, stress, and the environmental degradation that we see around us, I think on a personal and collective level, we have to move towards this idea of embracing abundance, not as excess, but as enoughness. And I started to do a little bit of research. There's not a lot of academic literature out there that kind of looks at this idea of enoughness as like a philosophical organizing principle, but there is a little bit. And it often conceptualizes this idea of enoughness with either contentment or sufficiency. And I like this because I think this idea of sufficiency helps us to move into this idea of appreciating what we have in the moment and finding satisfaction with what is rather than what could be. And I think in a world where we're constantly striving to produce more and create more and have more, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't want to push ourselves to do better and be better. I think the whole point of social change is that we recognize we can do better. And so as change makers, we want to aspire to do better. But we can still live in the present moment with this kind of logic of sufficiency or contentment underpinning what we do. I think in a world that kind of glorifies this idea of excess and this constant striving for more, this philosophy of enoughness can really offer us a refreshing alternative. Contentment and satisfaction can be found not in the pursuit of things that are bigger, things that are better, things that are newer, but in recognizing the intrinsic value within the present moment. And this isn't about settling for mediocrity. It's not about denying the possibility of improvement at an individual or a collective level, but it's about being in a state where we feel as though the present situation, an object, some kind of experience is perfectly fine as it is. The philosopher John Locke describes this idea of enoughness as covering a spectrum from the upper reaches of what we'll do to things that are so good that there's no reason for them to improve. So I like to conceptualize this as like a scale of enoughness. On one end, you've got what we'll do, and on the other end of the scale, you've got so good that it doesn't need to be better. We could see this idea of enoughness when you sit down and eat a meal that you tend to cook for yourself quite regularly. And that meal will do. It's going to fill you up. It's going to provide you with enough nutrition. And you can get a sense of enoughness because that is something that will do. And that's at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is when something is so good that it doesn't need to be better. This might be when you sit down and have a meal with some family or friends and the cooking is great and you don't need to compare it to something else. Sure, you could sit down at a Michelin star restaurant and have a professional chef cook a meal for you that would be an objectively better meal. But in the moment that you're sitting down and enjoying that meal with your family and friends, that is so good that there's no need for it to be better. There's no need for you to think, how could I make this better than it already is? And so I think at its core, enoughness is really about this idea of presence. It's about being fully connected to the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think this perspective is something that has helped me shift my way of thinking, not only at a personal level, but just in terms of the work that I do working with other social change makers. We live in a culture of more, and this has contributed to a lot of our social and environmental issues, including inequality, ecological degradation. And so this kind of philosophy of enoughness aligns quite closely with a lot of existing economic or environmental movements, things like degrowth, indigenous wisdom, environmental economics, or even permaculture, which is something that I am quite passionate about. If you're drawn to this idea of enoughness and kind of abundance as what we have when we can come together and work together, I will leave a link to an article that I wrote on my Substack about this topic, but I also have a podcast episode all about this idea of collective enoughness as a theory of change. So collective enoughness is a philosophy, it's a practice, it's a process that kind of helps us to realize that in our interconnected and interdependent world, we have everything we need when we work together. And so there is this wonderful theory of change that I love. It's called Catalytic Thinking, and it was initially proposed by Hildy Gottlieb. It revolves around these three interrelated observations about the world and is kind of form the foundations for how we can approach our work that we do as social change makers. So one of them is very much focused on the power of causality. It looks at how our power to create powerful results for social change lies in our ability to create favourable cause and effect conditions towards those results. It looks at the power of people. It's never about the thing that we're doing, but rather the people, and how the most favourable conditions that we can create in the work that we're doing are those that are going to bring together the right people and bring the best out of those people that we're working with, rather than just focusing on the stuff that we need. And the third observation is that it focuses on the power of this idea of collective enoughness. So together we have everything we need, and it's only when we are working on our own that we experience scarcity. Catalytic thinking is a great theory of change that kind of enables us to operationalize this idea of enoughness and collective enoughness. So if that's something that interests you, I will leave a link to a podcast episode that I did where I dived into collective enoughness as a theory of change. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a bit of a different one for me to just sit down and talk and think things through. Oh, my dog is so cute right now. But I did start a Substack a few months ago. It's my Ecological Wisdom Substack, and it's just a place for me to compile my thoughts on different topics related to deep ecology, the work that reconnects, permaculture, and my spiritual practice as somebody who practices green, or as I like to think of it, more ecological witchcraft, and how I let my spirituality and the work that I do across the social change space be grounded in these kind of laws or principles that we can observe in the natural environment. And so this idea of abundance as enoughness and collective enoughness is just one of those kind of organizing principles that I observe in nature and that I like to use as a guiding principle in my own work across the social change space. If you enjoyed this video, I would love if you could give it a thumbs up so I know what kind of videos you like, and definitely feel free to subscribe to my channel. I create videos about my work all across the social change space, documenting my mission to live consciously, explore and change the world. I have a podcast where I answer questions from our community about all things social change related. I talk about my doctoral research. Yeah, so if any of that interests you, hopefully you found the perfect little corner of the internet for you.